So hi everyone. Welcome remotely from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Phil Liu, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. Today's webinar is titled Climate Adaptation Science to Support Amphibian Conservation in the U.S. Caribbean. And we are excited to have Adam Taranto and Jamie Clauso with us today. To introduce our presenters, we have NCASC Chief Scientist Sean Carter to lead. So Sean, take it away.
Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's my privilege to introduce a few good friends and fellow researchers. First is Adam Taranto, and he's a USGS research ecologist focusing on climate impacts with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. He's a geographer and climatologist by training, and he received his PhD in geography from Penn State, where he examined the relationship between climate extremes and future crop yields in the U.S. At the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, his work focuses primarily on the impacts of global change on ecosystems in the Southeast and the Caribbean, and the complex human-environment relationships that drive these processes. Jaime Collazo is a research wildlife biologist and unit leader at the NC State Co-op Unit, Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and he's a professor in the Department of Applied Ecology at NC State. Jaime has a BS from the University of Puerto Rico and received his PhD from Iowa State University. And his teaching interests lie in hierarchical species habitat modeling of tropical avian biology, and his research interests focus on the demographic processes and species habitat relationships for endangered species conservation. So you're going to hear their talk today is going to touch on all of these topics. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Adam and Jaime.
Thanks, Sean. I will start out by giving a little bit of context and also to thank you for promoting me to a unit leader. I'm actually the assistant unit leader, so I'll take that as an omen. The project started in, Adam and I put this project together back in 2013-14. And the impetus for it and motivation was a couple of research and conservation priorities by our stakeholders, which are the Puerto Rico Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Region 4, specifically the Boca Raton Field Office. And these priorities, these two research conservation priorities were improved climate projections and application of dynamically downscale data for conservation. And the other one was to provide these agencies that I just mentioned with information to guide decisions regarding the recovery of listed species and preventing the listing of others. Specifically, we will characterize the sensitivity and ability of some amphibians, which I'll mention in a minute here, to cope with environmental stresses, to map the genetic structure of 7 representative species and identify centers of genetic diversity and gain some insights on connectivity. And then lastly, assist the agencies in the development of conservation strategies centered on 2 potential adaptation strategies. These are species relocation to new habitats, either translocations or introductions, and identify climate resilient habitats or climate refuges. Adam and I recognized early on that carrying out this project would take a number of years, and that obviously it is multidisciplinary in nature. Therefore, we assembled a team of collaborators. Many of them are local from the University of Puerto Rico and others from across the U.S., NC State, California Academy of Science, Illinois, Eastern Illinois University. And these are in the areas of amphibian ecology, ecophysiology, genetics, and decision analysis. Our approach has been to gradually build towards those long-term objectives, but in the process deliver some products of value for our stakeholders. So our focal group will center around 17 species of frogs of the genus Eleutherodactylus, which are commonly known as coqui. 15 of which are endemic, so we have a high degree of endemism. The species are of high conservation priorities for the work of these agencies. 3 are endangered, and the remaining are at risk of becoming endangered by virtue of either their patchy distribution, low vigility, or very specialized, and because they're very specialized to microclimatic conditions. So their dependence on these conditions, these microclimatic conditions, make them a suitable biological model to assess current and projected consequences induced by environmental change, including climate change. Adam will, for the next few minutes, will present an overview, give you an overview of both of these project components and how they come together to address the conservation needs of the agencies. Although the work is being conducted in Puerto Rico, it'll be obvious to you that methods and applications can be adapted by stakeholders in the U.S. or somewhere else, elsewhere in the tropics, particularly the Caribbean basin. So with that, Adam, take it away.
Thanks, Jaime, and thanks for that, laying all the background and context there. So I'm going to lay down a little bit more context before we get into the meat of what Jaime and I have been working through these past 7 years now. So why are we all here? At least in my shop, we're the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. We're in the Anthropocene, or at least I hypothesize, I believe that we are. Humans are now the dominant drivers of many global processes, of fundamental biogeochemical processes, such as the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So here's just a figure showing that carbon dioxide is higher in the atmosphere, is higher than any point in at least the last 800,000 years, probably more like the last 3 million years. And so there's a response, a physical response to that change in the radiative balance, this radiative forcing. The Earth is warming. It has all sorts of different consequences. And so given that humans are the driving force behind this large change, as a society and as decision makers have to then grapple with that. And really I think of this in two main ways. One is there's sort of the decision up top, should we put less carbon into the atmosphere? That's not really in my purview in terms of what I work on. But down below, there's the other sorts of actions or decisions that we have to think about. And that's what actions are needed to accomplish our objectives given however much climate change we're experiencing now and that we could experience in the future. So in the top, that's sort of like the global decision. That's the decision. And at the bottom, that's more the adaptation decision. That's the decision space that we operate in, that our science operates in terms of helping our stakeholders figure out what climate change means for the things that they manage and have a responsibility for, and how they can manage that risk. So again, both of these decisions, when we think about climate change or global change, sort of a risk management type of decision. Is the risk, what is the risk? What are the consequences? And how do we manage that risk going forward? So adaptation becomes really a complicated proposition because it's multidimensional, multi-scale. You're thinking about all sorts of different decision points and different objectives and values that we have to weigh the trade-offs against. And science can help in all those aspects. So that's where this is coming in. This is a figure from the National Climate Assessment, the recent one, and thinking about adaptation as iterative risk management. This is sort of like, the gold star of where, or the vision of where we'd like to go, if we could. And so this is sort of getting through that adaptive management cycle, where going from awareness to assessment, planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. These inner semicircles here are trying to describe where past climate assessments have tried to go in terms of how far through that adaptive management cycle we've been able to go. But in general, I like to think of this also just in terms of where our science tends to operate, whether that's in USGS or across our partners and across DOI, Department of Interior. And historically, USGS, and I say in academia potentially, their comfort zone has been more in these first two circles and then maybe part of the monitoring and evaluation. It's harder for our science to get effectively entrained into planning or implementation, but to really have a true adaptive management cycle, we really have to be working towards that. We have some great examples of that, particularly in USGS, and from folks at different centers excel in that, like Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. But that's still an area where that's an ongoing process to be able to make that happen. So Jaime and I and some colleagues, again, at NC State and USGS, we wrote a paper trying to think through this and sort of simplify that adaptive management type process and what that would look like. And just to simplify it as much as possible, you can think of it in these three big boxes. And we've also then sort of overlaid this idea about through all this, you do still need that basic scientific research, that foundational research to provide the insights and knowledge base that allow you to enter into and build an effective adaptive management cycle. And if you want more information on that, that paper was published in Wetlands a year or so ago. All right, so getting in the meat of what we're talking about here, these at-risk species in the U.S. Caribbean, and Jaime set this up nicely, but just so everyone's aware of where we're talking about, this is the U.S. Caribbean, mostly focusing on Puerto Rico, but part of the project did also include the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so we're down here in the border of the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Jaime already talked about the species we're thinking about. It's the Eleutherodactylus genus and 2 endangered species, 14 at risk. So there's a strong management concern for how do we help these species persist and recover through time, and when and as the climate is now in a non-stationary period, meaning it's getting warmer, how do those management actions change? How do the risks change that decision makers need to consider? Well, so one big thing they have to consider is that a warming climate just doesn't mean in the region we're talking about that things get warmer. And unfortunately, for the most part, there's pretty good evidence that we think there will be drying in this region. This is called subtropical drying, and there's a lot of work that's been done to sort of nail down the theoretical basis for why we think this region in the Caribbean could be more prone to that in the future. But that's what we're showing, and that's sort of for a moisture-sensitive species like amphibians, that becomes a real concern then for how do we adapt, and first of all, what is the level of risk that managers are facing and that these species are facing, and then what actions might help mitigate or reduce that risk. Puerto Rico itself is really varied in terms of the amount of precipitation received across the island. This is showing annual precipitation averaged over about a 30-year period. You go from the northeast part of the island in El Yunque, which is the rainforest mountain area here, talking about over 4,000 millimeters of rain a year, down to the southwestern part of the island, less than 1,000 millimeters a year. And so that's a huge difference. And then corresponding to those sharp precipitation gradients, you get sharp changes in the ecosystems and the ecological, what we call here, life zones across the island, going from rainforest down to subtropical dry forest across most of the southern part of the island. So you have this rainforest type of systems in different parts of the island. Here again, showing El Yunque, although it extends across also the central mountain range as well, down to here's Guanica dry forest, where you'll have a much different sort of landscape and a different assemblage and mix of species. So if overall we expect drying in the region, how will that affect amphibians specifically on the island? Will you have something like in El Yunque, would it maybe migrate to something that's more like this? So not quite Guanica, but something more mesic, but definitely something drier. And so thinking about that across the island, how are these gradients changing over time? How could they change over time, and what does that mean for these species? That's sort of the central part of what we're working on here. And that's where we combine the climate science and the ecology in this project. And again, to do that, we need this foundational research and to help build that knowledge base. We're starting from a lot of unknowns and uncertainty, both about what the climate response would be in the island and what the amphibian response or the ecological response to that climate change would be on the island. And ultimately, then all this is adding up to, have the same color coding here, thinking about the red or the blue areas here, that's really where that space we're operating in, trying to evaluate candidate strategies that would be useful for managers to consider that they could then adopt and would lead to effective adaptive management as the climate changes. But to do that, we need to understand the relationship between climate, ecology, and the biology of these species that we're working with. And again, back to that's that foundational knowledge that we're working towards, is we really need information about the climate response function of the species and systems of interest. What are those climate sensitivities? How do they affect different parts of the life history, the population parameters of these species? How are all those things sensitive to climate? Are they sensitive to climate? If they are, which climate variables are they most sensitive to, and in what ways? And then how will those climate variables, how do we think they might change in the future? And so one way, to think about this, sort of building up why we went about sort of the climate modeling pathway that we did. Here's a toy example. Jaime drew this example where you think about on the y-axis here is a risk of extinction for a particular species. And let's say that risk is higher if you're starting off in the dry forest in Guanica because the species needs a wetter, more mesic habitat. And that risk of extinction is much lower in the Maricao and the wet forest where the occupancy of the species is more prevalent. And if you think about that in current versus future, if the actual climate derivative variable we're interested in is, say, the time between rainfall events, maybe this affects the breeding season or something like that. As the region dries, you would expect then that risk of extinction to go up over time. Okay. And so global climate models, or GCMs, they provide that foundational knowledge for the climate risk characterization. So I already brought that into the discussion. We're worried about this subtropical drying phenomenon into the future. But the problem is that global climate models, their resolution is still very coarse. Here's an example. You could think of this as an example, one grid cell on a global climate model. I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs of global climate models, but just suffice it to say that they can't really resolve what's going on over the island, even though global climate models are very good at sort of understanding the overall climate system and even down to, say, the continental or subcontinental scale. When you talk about, say, islands in the ocean, they're not going to be able to resolve the complexity that's going on and how this, rock that's in the middle of the ocean really interacts with and affects the atmospheric response over the island. So here again is that map showing the precipitation, annual precipitation across the island. Whereas for a typical climate model, you would get one number of precipitation for the entire island. So it's not going to be able to understand how the mountains respond or interact with the atmosphere and cause that differential in precipitation. Not only that, but more importantly, then we're not going to be able to understand if there's going to be a different response to climate change across the island. So for instance, that regional climate response could manifest in different ways depending on where you are in the island because of the complexity in the topography and the land surface and how those then interact with and feedback with the atmosphere. So that risk of extinction, perhaps it goes up even more in the wet forest than it does in the dry forest, just as a hypothetical. These are the things where we're basically starting from a complete uncertainty knowledge base, and which is why then we decided to use something called downscaling, an approach called downscaling to be able to better understand the local manifestation of the global climate change response. And so downscaling, put simply, it resolves either explicitly through numerical modeling or empirically through statistical models the physical processes that are not resolved or are just ignored by GCMs because they're not operating at the scale that the GCMs operate at. So you can take into account things like topography, like on the left here, and how that would affect local climates, or really varied sort of land surfaces, like I'm showing here, say like how a mixed water and land sort of interaction or interface could then affect the climate over that area. So we're using something called dynamical downscaling, where we run higher resolution climate models over a smaller domain. We sort of stick in a high resolution limited area climate model inside the large global climate model. That large global climate model, we take the output from that and feed it into the higher resolution climate model. We're able to do that, and ultimately then the goal is to achieve a really higher resolution climate model down to 2-kilometer horizontal resolution, whereas a normal global climate model would be around 100-kilometer resolution. So this showing sort of in a nutshell our experimental design on the climate modeling part. The downside of using dynamical downscaling is that it's extremely computationally intensive. So if we're used to thinking about climate model ensembles, if you've ever heard that term, or looking at climate model results, typically you see like lots of different climate model output, say up to 20 models per emission scenario, and you might have 2 or 4 or 5 emission scenarios. We were not able to do that in the initial project that came with the funding, just because of computational and resource and personnel constraints. What we were able to do is use 3 global climate models and then 2 RCMs, or regional climate models, that were then split across these GCMs, and we used then 1 emission scenario. It's the higher emission scenario, and we did that over the mid-century. The reason we chose that higher emission scenario too is because that gives us sort of a nice bracketing of our uncertainty over time, where you could always, as a manager, sort of a cheat in terms of a different scenario, like a lower emission scenario would just be assumed that current conditions, the current climate is maintains through time. So you kind of by default, you get 2 scenarios for the price of 1. And using the higher emission scenario, you can bracket that emissions uncertainty. So the original GCM projection would look something like this, showing again the precipitation change by mid-century. You'd get 1 number for all of Puerto Rico. Not very helpful. We don't think that's going to be accurate. Then you see the before and after using the dynamical downscaling to 2-kilometer resolution. There's a lot more variation in the change, and you see different processes and patterns showing up across the island. And now you really see how the island interacts with and affects the local climates, and would change and really affect the local manifestation of the global climate change signal. So a nice thing about using dynamical downscaling is that there's many physical variables available compared to, say, alternative approaches to downscaling, such as statistical downscaling or empirical downscaling. So that gives us a lot more ability for our users and our stakeholders to be able to explore what climate change might mean for species or ecosystems that are sensitive to more than just, say, temperature or precipitation. But of course, there's a cost to that, and that cost is that there's time, storage, and processing constraints. So this was part of our co-production aspect of this project. Is we had a lot of stakeholder workshops with scientists and managers to think about, well, what sort of climate variables do we think are most important for the work that you're doing? And the idea there was to have climate projections that are specific to our decision or decisions that we're most concerned about with the frogs and the amphibians, but also that could be relevant to other scientific or ecological or management questions. And so in a sense, we're not only providing information for our specific project and our specific stakeholders, but really trying to provide public goods as well. And so the idea being that this information could be used for more than just the specific context here. So here's an example showing some of the output from the climate models. Here, for instance, is showing the projected change in maximum daily temperature. Annual precipitation change, again, there's that subtropical drying showing up, that regional drying, and you see it showing up here across the island. And you see there's quite a lot of variation in that pattern, but the overall signal is one of drying almost everywhere. with a few small notable exceptions, which I'll get to in just a minute. Again, with the dynamical downscaling, it's one really nice feature is that we can look at other variables besides just temperature and precipitation. So things like soil moisture. There's actually a soil moisture module or model within submodel within the RCMs we were using. Things like low-level cloud fraction. These become important for different cloud forest type systems where that saturated moisture at the surface level can become really important for some maintaining some forest systems and species that are sensitive to that. And there's a few hints from the results that elevation may provide some buffering against the broader regional projected drying signal that we expect. And so what I mean by that here is if you look at this image on the right, specifically just zeroing in there, this is for one combination of GCMs and RCM. So the CNRM, GCM, and what we call the WRF regional climate model. On the left is the same thing, same WRF model, but combined with the CCSM global climate model. And the blues mean that there's actually a projected increase in precipitation. And that, you notice, is over that area with that I showed you in the original figure with the precipitation, the really high really high rainfall areas of the island, the rainforest, El Yunque National Forest. And so that's a really interesting sort of thing to think about here is like, are these elevation areas providing some sort of buffering potentially against the broader drying pattern? We don't see evidence of that in the CCSM WRF combination. Here on the x-axis is showing elevation. Each circle here is an individual 2-kilometer grid cell. And then here's on the y-axis is the projected precipitation change by mid-century under the higher emission scenario. But we do see that in the CNRM WRF GCM run, where we do see this interesting pattern of a shift in the projected precipitation change as you go up in elevation. And just as far as, to get technical here for just a minute, we think we've been able to trace this back to how the broader GCMs are projecting changes in the low-level flow onto the island. And so the difference is that the CNRM model is projecting a stronger low-level flow from the northeast onto the island. That basically means you get stronger trade winds, and the effect of that is then over the higher mountainous areas on the island, you may actually get more forced convection and more precipitation that could be counteracting some of that broader drying pattern that we would see across the region. Without that increased low-level flow, which is what we see in CCSM, then local land surface feedbacks tend to dominate, which actually could result in even more drying than in the regional pattern of subtropical drying. So in essence, what we're seeing here is we're generating new hypotheses. We're not necessarily narrowing the uncertainty, but we're learning more about what climate change could mean locally on the island by taking this approach. And those hypotheses, new hypotheses that we're generating, can then be used to test new ideas and inform our next modeling, climate modeling that we do, and then we can start to narrow down some of those uncertainties that now have been generated by what we've learned so far. So again, back to that foundational research to provide those insights and knowledge base. So how does climate then affect these species? That's sort of the biology part of this is, it's nice to have these cool projections of climate change, which with the fancy climate models and the regional climate models. But if we don't know like how these species are sensitive to climate in the first place, that really isn't going to give managers much useful information. So broadly speaking, we're trying to figure out what are the environmental limits of these species and what climate variables are they most sensitive to. Well, one way we started out looking at that was we used acoustic recorders to help understand what are the occupancy of 3 Eleutherodactylus species across environmental gradients, basically precipitation and elevation gradients. And we do some cool things. We visualize the audio data using some software from some of our colleagues, and we're able to separate out the different species. And so we can see those across here where we can see the different patterns in the audio showing up depending on which species are there in the background of the forest. So the question then is like, are these gradients of occupancy likely to change with climate change here? So once we're able to figure out that sort of base understanding of how these species, where these species are living, and what sort of climate variables they're sensitive to, then the question is, how would the species potentially react as the climate warms and as the climate dries, and as that drying takes on maybe a more complex pattern across the island? So that's then where we can, again, using those insights gained from the high resolution climate modeling can help. And this is sort of where we're at now, is we want to take that information and then now that we are starting to really understand some of that, species sensitivities to climate, be able to use the climate model information to then build those candidate strategies. With translocation work, how about identifying climate refugia, something that my colleague Tony Limorelli is really an expert in. How can we develop different ways or actions that managers could use to really help ensure the persistence of these species into the future? So some of these next steps, I'm already sort of getting into that, but we've been able to apply the information we've had. Here's one example. With this paper is in review right now, and so we have one example where our colleagues are applying the climate model information that we have, and they've used a lot of occupancy model data, and again, using those acoustic recorders, and developing species distribution models to help with strategic habitat conservation. So this is showing that the projected always suitable areas by mid-century for selected avian and amphibian species, and then those combined areas, and you can see where those sort of match up then given the climatic changes that are projected, and that could be a useful tool for conservation planners and managers. Jaime, I'm going to let you talk to this slide if you want to unmute for a second.
Sure. Among those next steps, we moved on from occupancy to abundance, which in this case can only be done in 2 levels, either few or whole lot, which is we call it CORES. But we also looked at reproduction when we have not only occupied habitat, but once it's occupied, where do you have reproduction? Is it when there are a lot of them, or when there are a few? And then what are the sort of micro habitat conditions that lead to higher reproduction? So we were able to tie those 3 things together on the last iteration of work. Another component that we're tackling, we're starting, provided COVID gives us a break, is establish genetic population, the population structure, and gain through those analysis and concentrating in particular areas in Puerto Rico, insights on connectivity. We need to go through this tool first, not only to identify, again, centers of biological, genetic diversity, but also because monitoring these animals is not that easy, and certainly their movements is not that big. So connecting, understanding what impedes or facilitates moving among individuals it's going to be a challenge. So we hope to get some insights on this with the genetics work. This is another component that we also started to work with, and this is tackling the ecophysiological work of a project. And here the idea is to understand the sensitivity of these animals to environmental stress, in this particular case, climate change. So we're going to establish some basic, metabolic performance of these animals, oxygen consumption, CO2 emissions, water loss, those kinds of things given for instance, current or projected conditions in the future. We will also gain some understanding on what are the limits. For instance, basic work on CT max, that's the critical thermal maximum temperatures, to understand, how far can these frogs go in terms of tolerating extreme temperatures, and which we kick in, and that's the last thing I'll say about this slide, what we call adaptive capacity of these animals, which in this case is in such a terraria, we will look at the interaction between sort of the climatic or the threat, if you will, and the adaptive capacity through behavior, which may be, hiding under crevices, under some vegetation, debris, or what have you. There are ways that they can deal or buffer, if you will, these harsher conditions as they become reality in the future.
Okay, cool. And I'll come back to you in just a second, Jaime. And yeah, so then of course, like, the other thing that we're had to take into consideration was when Maria came through Puerto Rico in 2017, and so that was really just changed a lot in sort of the work we were doing, and of course just the logistics of working on the island. So here's some photos from our students afterwards, just showing the absolute devastation. But of course, you want to take this one in terms of what's maybe not devastation for some of these frogs.
Right. Yeah, over the years, I've worked primarily with birds, those of you that know me. And hurricanes are not good news for, certainly in the short term, for birds, especially frugivores or the carnivores. But for frogs, it's a different story, it seems to be. Unless the place is denuded completely, what you often find, as you saw in the previous slide, is a lot of debris, broken trees and what have you. And what it does is create the microhabitat for these individuals. So what we found, to our pleasant surprise, was that from the year before and the year after, is that they do exhibit higher population densities, higher reproductive activity, and it doesn't seem to be just a function or an artifact of aggregation. There's plenty of habitat around. They just seem to be doing a lot better and cranking up their reproductive rates. Part of it is because there's this explosion of food availability, and they take advantage of it. This is something that has been shown very nicely also at the Caribbean National Forest. Now it's the Yunque National Forest after Hurricane Hugo. And I think it was also being shown, it will be published soon in another part of the island. So these animals seem to be one of those few species that have a positive response to these catastrophic events for just about every other element of biodiversity.
Cool, thanks, Jaime. And so then this is wrapping up the last slide here. So again, we're just the big picture, the dream is to really work this in as adaptive management as a means to manage risk. We know there are risks with climate change, particularly in the U.S. Caribbean and Puerto Rico. Again, because warming in this region, we do think it's more likely than not it would mean drying, and at least under the greenhouse gas emission trajectories that we are currently on. So working with our managers and our stakeholders and our partners to build the base scientific knowledge, and then be able to effectively entrain this into an adaptive management cycle is really been our sort of shining star throughout this. And it's a long process. Like I said, this has been 7 years now, but we keep building those building blocks, and we're learning a lot along the way, both about the science and the species itself, but also how to go about doing this sort of actionable science. So with that, thank you, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Adam and Jaime, for that great presentation. So we are now moving to the Q&A session. Please feel free to ask any questions on the bottom right-hand corner, and we'd be happy to call on you. So we have one question from Jamie. His question is, are managers actually responding to your input? And advice on how to get them to respond to the kind of messages they often don't want to hear.
I think the answer will be yes, because they're seeking basically our advice, not only the information, but our advice. So we are hoping that that is the case. Yeah, that's basically what I can say right now. But so far, the information we've generated has been very much welcomed by management at both levels, at both agencies, the state and the federal agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service.
And Jaime, I see a question from Sean. What information is available for potential new diseases in this area as a result of warming and drying?
Yeah, that work is being tackled by some colleagues at the University of Puerto Rico, mostly the chytric fungus. And, I think they came out with a recent paper, I think it was last year in Science, but they dealt with it in a global scale, but they included the cases in Puerto Rico as increasing with warming in the areas that they've been studying, and then obviously with implications on survival of these species. So it's yet another factor that will come, another threat that comes as a result mediated through the global warming.
Great. And so we have one question from Carrie. They asked, how do you see these strategies you've developed during this project can best be extended to other regions/species?
You want to try first, Jaime? Then I can give a shot. Sure. Yeah. The fundamentals are basic and very, you can explore, you can pick them up. If you think about it, think about the way we're using translocation experiments to, for instance, learn what is limiting the distribution of a species. So one experiment will be moving these animals from occupied habitat to seemingly suitable but unoccupied habitat. Why are they not there? It's one question. I mean, this is something that can be done anywhere. We're also looking at what we call the extremes experiment, and that is moving animals from suitable conditions down to marginal and then perhaps into extreme conditions, and we would see how they manage. We learn, we're going back to the adaptive capacity of the animal, not only the physiological aspect, which we cannot measure directly, but we can actually measure movements, we can actually measure survival of these animals, and to learn, what to expect when these changes take place. So, again, in the ecophysiological realm, it's the same thing. We're trying to identify what are the thresholds, not only the ones that approximate lethal conditions, but those are more interesting, which are the sublethal conditions that affect, as I was saying, the metabolic performance of these animals, oxygen consumption, CO2 production, water loss. These things are sort of these subtle, hard to detect changes and adjustments that animals will have to make before things kick in really, strong or harsh conditions. So these are things that can be adopted by any other, emulated by any other set of colleagues anywhere in temperate regions or tropical regions. It's just really basic research to understand what are the limits and capabilities of these animals when they're facing, threats, especially if you can reproduce those threats in captivity, in lab conditions, as we hope to do, or through experimental translocations, as we're also planning to do. So those are two examples of how it can be transported to other areas.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to that, again, more on our strategy in terms of our research approach, Carrie, would be, I think the climate modeling was, I think we really I think that ended up being a really nice approach we took in terms of better linking up the ecologists with the climate modelers themselves, because those two groups often don't really have in-depth communication. It's usually the ecologists taking information from climate modelers, just taking what they can get. And so actually like bringing those two groups together in a true sort of co-production type of manner, I think was really helpful and can point a way forward. It's always sort of the interest from USGS, if I might say, in funding climate modeling ebbs and flows, if I'm being diplomatic. But I think we've demonstrated that there's definitely a need for it. And if we're going to actually be able to understand the risks that our stakeholders would face, particularly in areas where there's just not going to be off-the-shelf climate model information, useful climate model information that could be applied in these contexts. So I think we've been able to again, by sort of learning what's going on, even though it's actually probably increased our uncertainty, we have a better idea of what we know and don't know. So we have a better idea of those known unknowns now than we did before, where before they were just unknown unknowns, to use the Rumsfeld terminology from way back when. So I think that's been a big help and probably is an applicable lesson to other regions, certainly in the CASC network. I see Paige's question. I'll just read it. Do you see any indication so far that these species will be able to either A, adapt in place to changing climate, or B, move and track the habitat they need as the climate changes and make previously suitable habitat unsuitable, or vice versa? Jaime?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things we're trying to tackle and why we're trying to understand this physiological performance of these animals. And then along with that, some of the behavioral responses to see to what extent, as you probably know from your own studies, certainly the coquis, the flocks that we're talking about, they're not really good movers, especially if there's a lot of resistance, the matrix between the good habitat and the next good habitat. They, are real. To the best of our knowledge, experimentally, it's been shown that they can move as far as 100 meters, but normally they don't go beyond 10 meters. So that's not a whole lot of movement. So the so-called positive tracking will likely not be the best option for them. And that's why we're thinking about managed translocations to perhaps assist, as the whole thing is intended to do, assist these animals with migration. But what we're trying to understand a little bit is, again, with physiological work, because I don't think we can get to it yet with the genetics to understand it, at least in this first round, is what are their adaptive capacities. If you read the literature, and I know you are well aware of the literature, most people are hanging their hat on the adaptive capacity of these animals, but of course there are limits to that. And I think by pushing the envelope in terms of physiological responses to these stresses, we can start to understand where those thresholds are, and then the need to perhaps to take actions and then implement some managed translocations.
So what is the plan for using the findings from the ecophysiology experiments in terms of translating, say, temperature-dependent metabolic rate and water loss to environmental suitability?
Right. We hope that we can relate these these parameters or these responses, because we're going to be creating these conditions, emulating either current conditions or projected conditions. So the linkages will hopefully be there at least maybe 10 years initially, but we hope to strengthen those with time. But the idea is to then be able to go out in the field and measure these areas, measure some habitats, and then assess their suitability for translocation. I mean, part of what Adam and I would like to start doing as well, and we do have a plan to start doing that, is how do we connect the our understanding of these relationships that we're trying to, these fine relationships of species in the field and the microclimatic conditions that they respond to, most often, in terms of occupancy, abundance, and then reproduction, and then ecophysiological, with the downscale projection. And if we can do that, then if we can make those connections a little clearer, I think this is where we really gain a tool to then look at, for strategic decisions in terms of what habitat should be protected, because they have potential as climate refuges. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit what I have in mind, because I think that linkage is very important on this, what you call co-production.
Right. Yeah. So the part of the next step there, and this also gets a little bit back to Paige's question, is, we do have, at least from the climate models we've run so far, we can sort of start to piece together scenarios of based on the projections in the future, which areas on the island now are sort of analogs of the future. And some areas will just, they're projected, there is no analog. If you're in Guanica and it's projected to get drier in the future, well, there's no place drier than Guanica on the island. So you have to go to, I don't know, Arizona or something to find an analog. But, if you're talking about, say, the wettest habitats up in the mountains and the drying that's projected there, at least under one of the climate models, we have some candidate sites in the karst region, which is just a little bit north of there, that we think might serve as interesting and potentially good analogs for what those wettest montane areas might look like in the future. So some drying, but not completely xeric. And one of our collaborators, actually has some sites there that we are interested in testing some potential climate refugia and little microhabitat sites to see how, some of these species might fare there now, to get a hint at, like, well, how are they able to then survive in a place that is either a refugia site, so it's cooler or more moist than the surrounding area, or they can find shelter in the broader region there to get a sense of how we think they might be responding in the future as the climate changes.
Yeah. We need to make clear that the ecophysiological work provide us with, we can measure movement, we can measure, what they do, survival, but what may be inducing that mortality other than predators, which we know exist, is what we need to understand. There are a number of mediating mechanisms to affect that survival, that behavior, and ability to survive in a particular place, which may be stressful. And it is through this mechanistic understanding, for instance, the ecophysiological work, that gives us some insights of what the animals may be enduring or having to deal with as we put them in different habitats under different conditions. So they just provide some insights as to what are the mechanisms that lead to an ultimate response, which is measured in our case as survival of these animals, post-release survival.
All right. That's it for the questions.
Well, I just want to thank the presenters again for their valuable insight.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.